Some of you may have already seen part one of my meditation on this film. It's a video essay I tried to pass around in which I attempt a close reading of the choreography. And in stark contrast to the crushing concision and austere elegance of that 6 minutes and 38 seconds we just watched, my commentary, part one, clocked in at a vulgar, downright immodest 25 minutes. I just am that infatuated with this movie. Yeah, I got a little bit wordy. But if you didn't get a chance to watch part one, you didn't watch all the way to the end, or you didn't have a chance, but you glanced at the length of the video and thought better before beginning, don't worry about it. There was nothing in there that you'd have had to have heard to make sense of what I'm about to say now. But to satisfy my own completist tendency, let me put it all in a Tinkerbell-sized nutshell for you. I understand this woman's performance, whether it be a dance or an acrobatics routine. I'm not entirely sure. There's a lot that I don't understand. But what I'm claiming to understand, the insight that unlocks it all for me, is that she displays a character in this performance. She displays a character who can only ever perform. That's her performance, the plight of one for whom authentic and real world actions are rendered inaccessible by what she perceives to be a double bind imposed upon her by her extreme surroundings. Now, that's part one. This is part two, and I'm stepping away from the efforts to empathize with the character. Instead, here, I'm using terms common to mimetic analyses, and I'm going to describe the situation that encompasses her, that experience which from the inside feels like a continual stymie from a double bind, appears from the outside to be more like a total untethering or a complete loss of supportive structure. James Allison, our conference's kickoff speaker scheduled for tomorrow. James, I've noticed that you seem to be a little bit fond of a particular phrase, and now I'm fond of it too. We all know how that works. And James and I don't know each other. We don't know each other at all, but I've watched more than a few of your lectures online, picked up a book or two, and thank you. Thank you for putting together the Praying Eucharistically website and the homilies online. It's been helpful. I'm pretty sure in those exposures, I've heard you say this more than once, maybe seen it in print, being moved without being displaced. I'm not going to try and outline the theological concepts to which James applies this abstract description. I could only mess that up. But I would like everyone here to consider for a moment just how perfectly befitting this phrase is as a description of the everyday, all-day activity of breathing. Breathing, that most intimate act that certain ancient scriptures would seem to identify as being coterminous with life itself, beginning and end. Breath is always movement, and yet it's never going to knock you out of kilter, except perhaps in one very, very extreme circumstance, not unlike the final scene of that movie. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Before I inflict upon you part two of my verbose and meandering meditation on this film, how about we return to the creator herself? Surprise, surprise. Even above water, it would seem that Judy Gauthier doesn't need many words at all to get her point across. In the following 2-minute clip, you can watch the filmmaker give an exposition on exhalation. She actually does more than exposit. She enacts her understanding into and through the audience. And so if you're willing, you can do more than one. You can follow along. She is directing, she's telling us to do, but she's not telling us to become the doer of a necessary activity. Rather, she's indicating that we ought to allow a necessary activity be done upon us. It's not like a do it now because you better sort of thing, but it's still an imperative. Let yourself be inspired. In other words, breathe, not the kind of thing to which you respond, yes, sir, breathing, but okay, breathe. You see, it's more about relinquishing whatever you were up to than taking action. Mimetic analyses begin with the premise, as we saw with James Warren earlier, that the origin of every desire resides elsewhere. Consider a mundane example. I've seen too many variations on this one to cite any one person. It's the example of a toddler reading a magazine. Imagine. She's a toddler. She can't read. She's not even all that clear on what reading is, but she wants to read that magazine. And by wants to read, we can really only mean she wants to be like someone she knows who probably happens to have been reading that magazine or one like it quite recently. Her desire doesn't come from the thing. Her desire originates from within the someone who gestured toward the thing with some manner of concern. Using the jargon, the desirability of an object is conveyed upon a subject by a mediator. Or, in other words, we understand the toddler and the toddler's interest in the magazine through her interest in her predecessor's interest in magazines. Now, the trippy part, okay? That parent, her presence in the world as one who reads follows the exact same pattern. She too had predecessors in reading that magazine. The only difference is that there's always a far more extensive history to unravel. First, we'll ask, why that particular magazine? Was it her spouse who bought the magazine? Is the topic of the magazine something she likes to talk about with friends? Did she fall for some marketing campaign's algorithm? Or did a trustworthy person recommend something similar? So she picked this up because it seemed to be on point. It could have been any of these. It doesn't have to have been just one. It could have been a combination up to and including all of them. Furthermore, setting the specific magazine aside, what about the activity of reading in general? Because really that's what the precocious toddler picked up. Presumably, the history of those who have mediated the parents' interest in reading stretches back through nearly her entire life. Professors, teachers, peers, babysitters, all the way back to when she was first presented with one loving arm for cuddling and another arm holding a brightly colored board book. Notwithstanding the multiplicity of mediators spread out across decades, the underlying mimetic structure is the same for both the toddling proto-reader and the competent adult lector. It's the same triangle. It's the same structure. By identifying mediators along with the objects of interest to those mediators, you and I can uncover the genealogy of any subject. And when I say subject, just think a person being human. It's that abstract. This is mimesis, a mediated subject beholding an object. Not only can this triangular analysis be used to outline the creation of a new desire in a person's development, but the collapse of the triangle reveals something interesting about interpersonal conflict. It turns out it's not our differences that spur us toward antagonism so much as our similarities. The more we grow to be like our models, in model, a word I'll use interchangeably with mediator, The more we grow to be like our models, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish who is following whom. The leveling of two subjects without any third isn't a picture of zero mediation, it's double mediation. Each person mediates desire to the other, but their overlapping desire is for what exactly? Notice that the object node just dropped off the diagram. That's because it doesn't matter anymore. Whatever the object happens, whatever object happens to land in their desirous gaze, each person is going to want the other person to really, really, really want it too. And each person's gonna make damn sure that that other person who wants it so bad doesn't ever get anywhere close to getting it. Unless, of course, that object can be used as a weapon or a degrading insult, then they'll make sure the other person gets it and gets it good. Within this flat, perfectly symmetrical structure, there can be no ordering principle to clarify who should lead when. This means, unfortunately, there's no room for cordial turn-taking exchanges along the lines of, I'll give you this while you give me that, echoed by, of course I'll receive that, if you be so good as to receive this in exchange. That is beautiful. It's a dance, but that beautiful dance with its nurturing reciprocity requires someone to lead, or at the very least, it requires a comprehensible, unfading, and unambiguous cue for who has the socio-interactive right-of-way at this present moment. You need that. Because within the confines of simultaneity, you just have two rivals shouting on top of each other along the lines of, I'm about to give it to you, and you're about to take what I'm going to give you, whether you want it or not, countered immediately by who are you to give me anything, especially that? You can't give me what's already mine, and to prove it to you, I'll have it destroyed before I ever let you think you could ever give me anything. Yes, that brief amateurish method acting you just endured from me, I was drawing on a very specific biblical scene, but you might be able to guess. But the point here is that there are countless instantiations of aggressive outrage and righteous indignation, and they all boil down to the same loss of mimetic structure. I heard Gil Bailey on a recording one time point out how cartoonists, seemingly as a guild, have adopted an incisive visual trope for depicting this very thing. The two belligerents start their fight, and soon enough they meld into a ball of dust with the occasional fist or foot protruding. Imagine someone studying the panel closely. Oh wait, who was that kick from? Oh, and who's punching now? Those aren't pertinent questions at this stage. The artist concerned with essentials isn't at all bothered by irrelevant accidentals like those, and neither should the readers care, because when it's a fight, like a real fight, there ain't nobody. There's just fighting. But the picture I'm going to show you, slightly more nuanced, you find in Sarah Blackall's If You Come to Earth, published by Chronicle Books in 2020. Despite what the combatants themselves may think, their violent act is not an assertion of self over foe. Violence is when the assertion of self fails to gain an upper hand. It's not an establishment of one standing before the other, me conqueror, you vanquished, or the inverse, me vanquished, you conqueror. No, violence is the exact opposite of both of those. It's the progressing and unrelenting loss of any distinctive subjectivity. And if subjectivity sounds like too wonky a word, just think personhood. A violent act is always a loss of personhood to all parties. There is no violence depicted in Nama whatsoever. So why am I going on about it? Well, while watching this film, I began to wonder if there might not be more than one way for the mimetic triangle to collapse. And this evening, I'll ask you to join me in this speculation. And to do so, you'll need to entertain two premises. First, suppose it were possible for the mimetic three to be reduced to two, exactly as we just discussed with the Warring Brothers, except that hierarchy remains intact. This would mean that it's patently clear to all who the mediator is, and the subject is never once an upstart instigating rivalry. No, none of that. All that's lost is the node in the structure where the objects go. Now, a quick response from a mimetic perspective might be, meh, no biggie. Objects come and objects go rapidly and with zero fanfare. You see, our models can turn sticky and glom on to our very souls. And what that means is that at the other end, objects can get slippery, like buttered eels in bacon grease, slippery. And this is when we Girardians who have been at least halfway around the block love to mention casually the sprite-like flights of fancy in a midsummer night's dream. Yes, that's all true, but tonight I'm not talking about fickle desires and the mercurial substitutions of one object for another. I'm talking about what happens when a mimetic structuring that sustains the very potentiality of an object's existence is nowhere to be found. That is, a woefully unfortunate pairing between a specific subject and her mediator, which excludes any and every object. Oh dear, I've gotten wordy again, haven't I? What would this look like? I'm still searching through children's books for a good picture of this one. I haven't found it yet, but I did observe a brief exchange between two adult cousins of mine during a holiday get-together. Melinda, the oldest of all the cousins, held her younger she held her younger sister's tiny baby in her arms. We're talking maybe 2-3 weeks out from delivery. Oh, she groaned wistfully, "I miss newborns." You know, Melinda wasn't heartbroken, but I don't think she's just chatting up her sister with faux feelings either. She was, in some respect, I believe, genuinely sorrowful. She wasn't resentful that her kids had grown up, but she knew, and given the immediate context of having a swaddled baby in arms, she was forced to meditate on the fact that she would never be able to love her children as newborns again. She still had the wherewithal to be such a caregiver. And yes, she'd proven she could do it, but more important, to the point here, she'd enjoyed the experience and thrived in the role. And now she must reckon with the absence of any real chance that such a delicate and precious object would ever be placed in her care again. In that moment, it was just Melinda, an abstract mediator we will call caregiver, whose object of desire is equally abstract, any and all human babies. Subject, mediator, and a stark absence. This isn't a vacancy that stands ready to be filled. The X signifies a strident impossibility that any object could ever take up that exact structural position. And for Melinda, it won't ever happen again. So if the flat structure and its absence of hierarchy depicts a kind of anger, this structure offers us insight into a certain kind of sadness. Anger, sadness. If I haven't droned on and on and on so long that you forgot the title of this talk, you know what's coming next. But before we get to grief, I must introduce the second premise. As I briefly mentioned earlier, models can be quite sticky, so much so that the subject might not even notice when objects get switched up. Nothing less than our very sense of existence as a person in the world is mediated to us through our models. So when our models turn to a new subject, we're not going to question it. We might not even notice. If it's good enough for our mediators to want, we'll want it too. And the wanting could come so instantaneously, it'll feel like it's always been there. That's the stickiness of models, which, as I made clear earlier, we're not talking about. Suppose, though, there were a corollary wherein certain objects got sticky. A sticky object can prod a subject into abandoning her current model and set her off in search of entirely novel mediation. She'll do whatever she has to hold on to that one beloved who simply must be the one beloved. Now, unlike the randomizing carousel of desirables I compared to buttered eels before, changes in mediation won't slip by unnoticed. I don't think. Again, remember, the contention among so many mimetic theorists is nothing less than your very personhood comes from your models. So when that changes, you become a new person. And pardon me for a few moments while I recklessly mimic James Allison's commentary on the parable of the pearl of great price. And James, I'd like you to know that when this essay was composed for this very setting, no one on the planning committee had ever mentioned at all the prospect of inviting you. So had I known you'd be in attendance for this, perhaps I wouldn't be trotting out such a mediocre cover song right in front of the original artist. I don't think I would have done that. But then again, maybe I would have, trusting you to handle my shameless plagiarism tenderly. At any rate, this is where we are, and that's what we're about to do. Okay. Suppose, each and every one of you, suppose you were a merchant. Now, already we've said a lot. There is you, and we know who you are because we know who your mediators are, and we know what objects interest them. Okay, now, so suppose you're a merchant and you stumble upon, oh, there it is, a pearl of great price. We all know what happens next. You liquidate all your assets so that you can make the acquisition, and now it's yours. You have the pearl and nothing else. Guess what? You're not a merchant anymore. Newsflash, you ain't doing business with an inventory of one and only one item that, by the way, is never going to be put on sale. So your merchant days are over. Had those earlier business mentors of yours been stickier than the pearl, you would have left that shiny thing of exorbitant price right where you found it and gone on to do business elsewhere, profitable, but you didn't do that. And now, clutching to the pearl previous mediators abandoned, you will of necessity become someone else. Who exactly will you become? That remains to be seen, but you will become someone different. You see, the advent of a unique beloved can upend all your previous models for love. Merchanting sure didn't cut it, and neither does this green one, whatever that is. But the pearl is staying. So we got to try something else. If that does, okay, try something else, because the novel beloved demands a change in what and who mediates between you and all that's lovable in the world, not just pearls. This is conversion. But suppose, and here the parable's over, we are ricocheting off wildly in yet another direction. But suppose that while in the midst of conversion, goaded on by one such unique beloved, a worldview toppling, mediator obliterating, singularly sticky object, suppose that one were to be taken from you. If such a beloved were to be lost to the lover who, mind you, has already had her mediation with the world irrevocably scrambled, what's left for her? There's no replacement mediator imaginable that could somehow show her how to caretake for someone who just plainly is not there anymore. Nor is there any possible substitution of objects to be made, because it was that unique beloved and no other which brought with it the novel caretaking mediator she sought to embody but couldn't and now can. In one case, you need a model that grips you firmly if you're going to have a new fascinating object jumping in and pushing aside yesterday's fancies, a la A Midsummer Night's Dream. And yet another case, you need one of those extra sticky objects if you're going to keep insisting on a new mediator until you find one that fits your incomparable love for your singular beloved. Listen to episode 809 of This American Life, The Call, in which the story of a mother's seeking to love her pill-addicted daughter becomes a case study of a sticky object driving the search for any possible mediation that could work. But both those scenarios show that if you lose one of the mimetic three, you end up using the other to orient yourself enough to cobble together the next triangle. But what if the mediator and the potential for any new object are both gone in one fell swoop? There ain't no swaps or subs coming in. When that happens, there is no path toward even a semblance of mimetic structure. Even if there were entire galaxies replete with could-be lovable objects and tender-hearted models ready and at your disposal, it doesn't matter. For this person, there is simply nothing to work with and no one left to become. If a gift to you vanishes, you can't be a recipient anymore. If a gift to you that is also the giver vanishes, you lose a friend. But there are special someone givers who, as gifts, not only are giving you themselves, but they're also giving you yourself. And in the suffocating absence of one so all-encompassing to who you are, in that tank there is what? What's left to desire? You may well feel like there should be something to want, but you can see plainly that there isn't. You may still know what the things are that you should want to do, and you may pretend to want to do those things, but when you act, it's not in earnest, and you will eventually recognize yourself as one who's playing a vapid role. And even if you play that role exquisitely with a prodigious skill set that leaves the people around you in drop-jawed astonishment, you still know you're pretending. One behind-the-scenes tidbit regarding the performance by Madame Gautier: to begin each take, she held onto a weight that would sink with her down the 10 meters to the floor. This would save her the exertion of swimming. Then, while they pulled the weight up out of the frame, she would allow water to fill her sinus cavities. I won't pretend to understand the anatomy here. I don't, but I guess you gotta tense up at least a few face muscles if you want to keep water out of your sinuses. So if you want to present a totally relaxed face while at that depth, that's what you have to do. I mean, do you see where I'm going with this? Even putting a neutral expression on her face required expertise the uninitiated like me would never even think to consider. And so too does it go within the environs of grief, where nothing, absolutely nothing, is effortless. Don't be fooled by the emotional timbre in my voice. This is my coping mechanism for being nervous and talking to a crowd. The truth is, I don't speak from any experience, not even remotely. And yet, somehow, After watching Amma repeatedly, I almost feel like I have witnessed something of abject grief, a state wherein every desire becomes a charade. The only genuine longing that remains is to somehow be acted upon so as to feel alive again, but it's accompanied by dreadful knowledge that when that action does come upon you, it will be indistinguishable from the feeling of impending death. Let yourself be inspired. I mean, what a great line for a TED talker, right? To open an auditorium, I'm sure, full of effete intellectual types who consider a series of mini lectures to be a fun night out on the town. Allez, salon suisse. Just let yourself be inspired, she said, with a giggle. A line like that could get instant platitude status without the benefit of ever having been repeated by anyone. Like, what a thing to say. All right. Let me come clean. That thick sarcasm in my tone just now was a sincere concession to you, my listeners, that yes, if you want, it's easy to dismiss what you said, unless you recognize the speaker as someone who lives in the aftermath of trauma. In which case, the line isn't so easily dismissed at all. In fact, it kind of gets stuck in your ears. The peculiar imperative, it begins with an implied no. No, no, it won't be you who takes the next breath. But when you're ready, you can let yourself be inspired. I've been worried about sharing my thoughts today. Generally speaking, heavy-handed commentary can spoil a good work of art, but more specifically, apropos me, my soapboxes are heavy, and the way I stack them on top of each other could squash 1,000 subtleties from a lesser film. And there's too the nagging suspicion that I may have just white, middle-aged, cis-het America mansplained for like 40 minutes to an audience that assuredly includes people who, unlike me, have lived through trauma and have undergone the imposing permanence of grief. Me? I just saw it in a movie. I guess mixing all the metaphors I can think of beyond any sensible recognition and wrapping it all up tight in an allusion to the Big Lebowski, I am like a toddler who wandered onto the internet, picked up a cinematic pearl of incalculable value. It's been sticking to me ever since. Maybe after tonight, I can put it down. I doubt it. So perhaps the fullest summary of all you've heard from me today would be this. The double capital M, mimesis at the movies, is a Zoom group that convenes on the first Thursday of the month to use mimetic theory to analyze a pre-selected film. But the double lowercase m concept, mimesis at the movies, watch out. Because when that happens, it just happens to you.